Russ, how are you?
Long time no see.
Yeah, good to see you.
I guess we should start. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate your time. There are so many things to do that it's always difficult to navigate between them. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you a paper that I have written as an introduction to a forthcoming book that I edited for Liberty Fund, and this is Jacques Necker's reflections, on executive power in modern states. Some of you may not have heard about Necker or know much about Necker, so what I'd like to do is to give a short, presentation about the author, and then why we should care about this book, which I find remarkably interesting. Necker is someone who belongs to the ranks of the political losers, history's greatest political losers. The ranks are thick, and they are increasing day by day. But Necker occupies a large place in here. Necker is known mostly for having been the Minister of Finance under Louis XVI, who made public the famous finances of the Kingdom of France in 1781. The compte rendu, as they call it, in 1781, was the first time when the Kingdom of France made public its finances, and that created quite a stir at the time. And then in 1789, Necker was, at the time of the beginning of the Revolution, the Prime Minister of Louis XVI. Necker presided over the convocation of the Estates General in May of 1789, and he made some strong proposals for reform that were rejected by Louis XVI, and then he was asked to leave, and that triggered the fall of the Bastille on July 14th. Necker was recalled 3 days later. He came back to Paris in late July of 1790, and then spent 1 more year and 2 months trying to steer the ship of the state before retiring to his beloved place of Coppet in Switzerland on the shores of Lake Léman. Necker was by that time both a very known and very hated person. He was known and envied for his fortune. He was a banker of Swiss origin, and he was an extremely wealthy man. People were attracted to him because of his money, and it is rumored that his son-in-law, the famous husband of Jacques de Staël, was accepted the marriage because he had huge gambling debts that Necker paid more than twice. The same goes for Benjamin Constant, Jacques de Staël's colleague, lover, and co-author, who also had a gambling addiction that Necker paid off a few times. So Necker was a wealthy man, but very few people knew that he was also a major author. So when in 1821, Auguste de Staël, his grandson, edited Necker's complete works in 15 volumes, the public was surprised to discover how prolific the former minister of Louis XVI had been. Not only how rich, but also how prolific as an author he had been. Necker was the author not only of a monumental 2-volume history of the French Revolution, which is still not in print in France, de la Révolution française in 1796, but also one of the most important books ever written on the role of the executive power in modern society. And that's the book that I wrote this text for as an introduction for Liberty Fund. He also wrote on religion and politics, on the importance of religious opinions in 1788, and a course of religious morals in 1800. His final book was Final Views on Politics and Finance, published in 1802, And that was the swan song of a friend of liberty, worried about the prospects for freedom in France and Europe as Napoleon was about to declare himself an emperor in 1804. What I found remarkably surprising is that Necker's political works have not been re-edited in English for over 200 centuries, for two centuries, 200 years. And we still lack a full biography in English of the former minister of Louis XVI. The situation is not much different in France, and there are many reasons for that, but one of them is, in my view, that Necker defended the virtue of moderation. Marcel Gaucher was probably right to claim that Necker had against him two strikes. One, the fact that he was a political loser, and secondly, he was a moderate. So history has been unkind to Necker, to say the least. And I think that today he's slowly being rediscovered for his works on executive power. I'd like to say a few things about why executive power is an interesting topic before I present the main topics of the book, and then we can have a conversation on the text. The concept of executive power is a very ambivalent one. On the one hand, executive power is a necessity in any constitutional government, in any government, because no political commonwealth can exist without some form of executive power as the main locus of decision-making. But secondly, the executive power is a dangerous power. The stronger, the more dangerous, similar in some respects to the power of a monarch that can go astray. This resemblance might account for the traditional skepticism of Republicans towards executive power, that it was claimed might easily degenerate into tyranny. The extent of the power of the executive and the importance is demonstrated by the fact that it has the authority and ability to act quickly and effectively in cases of emergencies. And this was certainly demonstrated by the importance that John Locke gave it in the 14th chapter of the second treatise on government. But it also has the right to go sometimes beyond the law or ignore the law altogether. And this is the famous prerogative power that appears in the writings of many authors from starting with Locke and going forward. So there is a fundamental ambivalence of this power that is simultaneously subordinate in the framework of a constitutional government and not subordinate, both weak and strong at the same time. And this dual nature of the executive power, I think, is something that struck Necker at the time of the writing as worth discussing. On the one hand, the executive is merely an agent that acts to advance the will and the interests of the sovereign, most likely the people, but it's also an independent actor on the political scene that can take decisions in cases of reason of state. So on the one hand, the executive needs energy, proper energy and proper scope, but on the other hand, we need to tie, and we want to tie the hands of the executive power in order to prevent it from becoming arbitrary or tyrannical. So the question that Necker confronted when he started talking about this is how can one create a viable executive power that is neither weak nor passive and constitutionalize it at the same time so it can never become tyrannical or arbitrary in the hands of one individual or several persons. In the second section of the paper that you had a chance perhaps to look at, I look at the debates on this side of the ocean in America on the idea of a strong executive power, and I comment on a little bit in passing on the importance that Alexander Hamilton gave to the executive power and the vital role that executive power should play in the architecture of constitutional government. I also show that according to the Federalist Papers, the powers had to be properly separated and balanced against each other at the same time. Balanced and separated. It's not just separation, it's balance of powers. And I also comment briefly on the debate between Hamilton and Madison, who used pseudonyms. Hamilton wrote as Pacificus, Madison as Helvidius, in a public controversy on the role of the executive power in foreign policy in 1793-94 after the Declaration of Neutrality by Washington. But one point is clear, that the founding fathers here decided to leave a kind of a flexibility, to give a little bit of flexibility to executive power. They didn't want to define too closely the office of the president. They actually struggled with the office of the president during Constitutional Convention. So this was a topic that they were unsure about, and they left it somewhat flexible. The French, however, took a different route, and this is what Necker dwells on in this book. This is a book written in 1792, so this is a year after the completion of the first written constitution in France, which was passed in 1791. The Constituent Assembly started its work in the summer of 1789, as the Americans were passing the Bill of Rights, by the way, and completed it in, I think it was in May or June of 1791. It was passed in September of 1791. And Necker's on executive power in the great states is a strong critique of the route taken by the French. In this book, Necker offers almost chapter by chapter critique of the Constitution of 1791, but also offers a strong theory of executive power that is both energetic and limited at the same time. The main question that he took up in this book is how can we have a constitutionalized executive power that preserves liberty and has also the energy that is needed in order to accomplish its task. This is the question that I think was best answered by Necker, among others, because Necker combined in this book the advantage of being the politician that he was with the political thinker that he was trained to be in the tradition of constitutionalism. Necker draws in the book upon the wisdom of Montesquieu, about the wisdom of Delolme, who was the other important thinker that we no longer read today. Jacques Delolme was the author of an important book called The Constitution of England, and Necker builds upon that. Necker comes out in the book as an admirer of the English Constitution, and certainly he has a lot to say about the virtues of the English Constitution. But there are 4 reasons for which this book is worth reading today. Many people wrote about the English Constitution. Many other people criticized the route taken by the French. First, I think the book offers us a restatement of Necker's original political philosophy, which in a previous book I called moderate political philosophy. Necker assumed during his tenure in office the task of and the role of a trimmer seeking to keep the ship of the state on an even keel. He was exposed to the crossfire of the extremes, and he, as a result, espoused a conservative type of liberalism, in my view, that sought to, on the one hand, advance the demands of justice. He was one of the most fervent advocates of the reconstitution of the French Estates General. He wanted to give the third estate full and equal representation, and actually double its representation in the Estates General to shed light on its numbers. But also Necker was someone who espoused serious reservations about any constitution that vested too much power in the people. So that's the conservative aspect of Necker's thought. He was afraid of demagogues. He was afraid of leaders of political sects that would use appeals to the people in order to justify their own desire for power. Second, the book makes a strong case for an interesting type of constitutionalism that, on the one hand, offers us an energetic and limited executive power, but on the other hand, invites us to reconsider the doctrine of the checks and balances. Necker took the deputies of the Constituent Assembly to task for failing to create a sound balance of powers, and for presenting the weakening of the executive power, the monarch, as a victory gained for liberty. So he thought that the constitution that emerged from the debates of the Constituent Assembly offered an unbalanced constitution. His preferred form of government was an English constitutional monarchy, in which the monarch reigns but does not govern, and in which the nobles provide an indispensable intermediary body as a rampart to the throne. But Necker also thought that the French have failed to understand the importance of the executive power. Now, it was easy on the one hand to do so in the aftermath of 1789, when the fear of the executive power and the aristocracy was at the high point in France. But on the other hand, I think Necker understood that A state in which there is one power placed above all others, without a counterpoise, without a counterbalance, is a state in which freedom will always be endangered. So the doctrine of the balance of powers is what Necker took to task for, and he sought to revise it and redefine it. And it's interesting that how he did it. So he redefined the meanings of both the executive and the legislative power. In a well-constituted government, Necker argued that these powers ought to share, in various degrees, the exercise of both the legislative and executive functions. On Necker's view, and this is interesting, I think, to restate today, the executive power means what he called organe de gouvernement, providing the necessary leadership and initiative, while the legislative power should serve as organe de contrôle, a checking body, providing equally needed supervision in the state. Next, Necker complemented the theory of the functional separation of powers with what he called the l'entrelacement des pouvoirs, which translated into English would sound like intertwining of powers. Loosely translated would be intertwining, blending of powers, dependent upon the existence of effective links between the executive and the legislative. In the absence of such links, Necker argued, all quote, would be contest and confusion on the political scene. The powers of which a government is composed are intermixed, he writes, by means of various ties that make possible their dialogue, checking, mutual checking, and cooperation. And he writes this: were we to discard these principles of union and substitute laws of equilibrium in their stead, it would be necessary, if I may so express myself, to place a sentinel on the confines of every vanity, every sort of self-love, every individual ambitions. And it is in his view the existence of such harmonious links between powers that is essential to creating a sound and balanced government. And he ends up by concluding these are ties then, proportions, fitnesses, which must contribute to the harmony of government. And this is the theory that I find most interesting in light of debates on constitutionalism today. The third part of the paper deals with Necker's critique of revolutionary radicalism, which is in 1792, I would say, a restatement of some of the points made by Burke in the reflections on the revolutions in France. I will not dwell on that. We can talk about it in the question and answers time. But I'd like to conclude by saying a few things about the fourth reasons for which this is a book worth reading today. And this is an interesting book that stands out among its peers through its innovative comparative analysis of three political traditions. Usually, the French, or at the time in France, the comparison was England. Necker, while he was an admirer of the English constitutional, unwritten constitution, he was also an admirer of the Americans. And in the book, in the second volume, he devotes quite a lot of time spelling out the lessons that he thought the French could learn from the Americans. He was an excellent connoisseur of the US Constitution 4 decades before Tocqueville, so in a way he is a precursor of Tocqueville in this regard. It's important to point out that Necker and the French took a strong interest in both the American federal and the state constitutions. And the peak of the interest was reached in 1789 and 1790, which is an interesting detail. During this period, significant documents were drafted, such as the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and important parliamentary debates took place in the Constituent Assembly on bicameralism and executive veto. And it's interesting to point out in conclusion that there was another reason for some of the French fascination with America. It was seen as a way to combat the influence of English ideas in France. People were looking at America to say there's another model than the English. Necker, I thought, tried to combine the two in an original way. For him, England did not represent the past of mankind, while America stood for its future. He thought that the combination of England and English and American political and constitutional principles were actually possible for his countrymen. And in a way, he took issue with those who thought, in the words of one of the deputies to the convention, that you can and we should go beyond America. He said, no, you need to combine the principles of English and American constitutions. Necker was not of the opinion that the French would have and could import wholesale the American principles and institutions. He appreciated the energy that the Americans gave to the executive power, and he was appreciative of the fact that the Americans added the Bill of Rights after passing the Constitution, not before, as the French went about writing their own Constitution in 1789. Necker thought that America had one other advantage over European countries, and that was its federal system. Necker appreciated the federal systems because he thought that this created more opportunities for self-government and decentralization that France also needed at the time. Now, as I pointed out, this is a book that has been lost to the cracks of history, intellectual history. It's remarkable that political theorists in general have lost sight of the book, maybe because, as I said, he was seen as a loser, maybe because he was seen as a moderate. One thing is clear, however, that in Taming the Prince, the book that Harvey Mansfield published about 25 years ago, on executive power, Necker is the glaring missing author. There's everything there from Marsilio di Padua, Aristotle, Marsilio, Federalist Papers. Necker is absent. And I think that it's time to give Necker his due. And I hope that when the book will come out with Liberty Fund, probably in 2 to 3 years, we'll have a chance to appreciate the richness of the book, but also how courageous he was as a moderate in revolutionary times. Thank you. I don't expect anyone to have read the book, but if you have read the book, we can talk about the details. But otherwise, I can answer any questions that you think, and any suggestion for improving the text, which is a work in progress. Actually.
Do we have a moderator for today?
I don't know that we do.
Sorry?
You're gonna have to call on folks. I guess we don't.
Yes,
have
yes.
a-
No, I'll
You're not introducing him?
No. I'm just sitting here.
That's fine. That's fine.
I'm really sorry. Really.
Is it
No,
in any event?
yeah. Okay. Let's start. Yeah. No.
So, I don't know how much you know about the workshop, but we're quite an eclectic group. Some of us are deep thinking scholars, sweep of history, even classics. And some of us are more engineers who build bridges in a social setting, who design structures and so on. And we don't think very deeply in anything more than 50 years old. We have a hard time actually comprehending. And so when I saw your paper, I was really excited. I thought, oh, the executive power in modern society, and I realized we have very different definitions of modern society. And so what I thought I would ask is, what are the lessons for today from this? For somebody like myself, who's basically a shallow thinker who tries to just get stuff done, what are the lessons here that we might apply to today's setting, particularly given the rather interesting, and you allude to this in your conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good way to start. So this is a book written in 1792. My favorite time, what I would have liked to live, probably would have been a little bit later. Let's say 1830s. That would be my preferred time. But 1792 was an interesting time because the French Revolution was at its height, I would say. So just before the terror, the French were engaged in an interesting experiment, social, political, and economic experiment. The economic experiment was disastrous. They created the assignat, paper money that went nowhere. The country went bankrupt after that. And Necker was an economist, but a banker and economist predicted that. But there were other things. There was the hope in the air of reforming society. And Necker, the first lesson that we can draw from this is the call to moderation from this book. And Necker himself says we need to make due reforms and we need to learn from the mistakes that we make. That's the first one. But But the more interesting one, it has to do with constitutionalism and balance of powers. And the debates in America around the executive power were interesting, and I know we'll have a chance to talk about a bit later about this. But the French tell us a different story. They were distrustful of the executive power because the monarch had just been toppled in 1789, and they wanted to build a system in which the people would be sovereign. So that was the first impulse. And Necker tells them that this is something that has to be moderated through bicameralism, two chambers, executive veto, and so forth. For us today, I think we are now firm believers in the doctrine of the separation of powers. And we think that the three powers ought to be separated functionally, but also with regard to the persons who exercise those functions. And Necker pretty clearly, with his theory of intertwining of powers, tells us that it's not enough to separate powers. We need to blend them. We need to put them in a condition that they would cooperate.
You referred to that. What are the practical implications of that? It's one thing to say they need to be blended, but what does that mean? Communication, functioning together side by side?
Functioning together side by side would not be enough, and that's one of the things that he does. What I find interesting here is that the way in which he defined the meanings of the executive power and the legislative power. As I said, the legislative power for him is executive power is organe de gouvernement, leadership. Legislative power is what he calls organe de contrôle, providing needed supervision. Both executive, as we understand it today, and the legislative can exercise these functions. And it's interesting that especially law specialists know, the doctrine of the balance of powers has historically been grounded in the recognition of the supremacy of the legislative power. So the doctrine of the legislative power has historically been grounded in the recognition of the supremacy of the legislative power. Or Necker tells us that it's executive that is the supreme power in the state. This is something very odd, I think, that needs to be unpacked properly. But for us today, it means basically that we need to be very careful about how to construct the cooperation between the two powers. And we see today with an executive, today the danger is not the legislative going astray. Today for us the danger is a weakened legislative power and an overarching executive power. So in a way the stakes for us today are different. That's to conclude my long answer to your short question. And I think that's the difficulty for us to appreciate this book, because the stakes are different. We are concerned today with an overarching executive power that has used emergency powers in order to stretch well beyond the imagination of Necker and others before. But what I think we should be also learning is that separation of powers is not enough. We need blending and balance of powers. I'll take two questions and I'll try to answer both.
My question's quite messy, so I don't know if it's...
Okay, go ahead.
So
Bill's will be messy too.
I'm thinking about this exact time, and I'm thinking, based on your description of Necker, it actually seems quite close to John Adams at pretty much the same time, who was, the same sort of brave, conservative, moderate role in the U.S. at that time that Necker, you say, is playing here. And of course, Adams, horribly written 3 volumes on defense of the constitutions of the U.S., was written in direct response to Turgot's attacks on the U.S. state constitutions, most of which were heavily indebted to Adams' previous writings. So I guess what I'm wondering is, so where's the moderate middle? So you have Necker and Adams on sort of this moderate conservative side. Does that put Turgot and Condorcet on sort of a moderate liberal side two others who were, Diderot and D'Alembert and so forth.
I comment a little bit on Condorcet in the second part of the paper. So it's interesting, the combination between Necker and Adams and the connection between the two. If you combine their ideas, do we have the same package or not? And I think there's an affinity there between the two. Condorcet wrote an important book in 1786 called The Influence of the Revolution of America on Europe, 1786. And he was in the forefront of those who believed that America was a step ahead of Europe in the fight against superstition, ignorance, and intolerance. And for him, America stood for individual rights and liberties, religious toleration, and those are the founding documents. America was, for Condorcet and for others in France at the time, mankind's best hope. And it's interesting that the same idea appeared in Turgot's text, and Necker knew Turgot well because they worked together. They weren't on friendly terms all the time. But in a letter to Richard Price in 1778, Turgot actually wrote, America is the hope of the world, it became a model for us. So it's conceivable that Necker was influenced by this appreciation for America from Condorcet and from Turgot, though there were differences in their philosophy. Certainly Condorcet would be further to the left of Necker, because I put Necker in the camp of conservative liberalism here. But I would say that the translation of the state constitutions made by the Duke of Rochefoucauld d'Anville in 1783 played a key role in disseminating the principles of American state constitutions and federalism in France. And I think that's the source of information for Necker. But I agree with you that there's a similarity between Necker and Adams in this regard. Necker, however, I wouldn't know to give an exact answer on how much emphasis he placed on mixed government, because that's a topic that appears in Adams' defense of the Constitution of America. Certainly, there is a role that he gives to nobility. He was not a noble, by the way. He was a bourgeois and a rich person, but not a noble by birth. But certainly he believed in the need for balance. So in that regard, yes, the metaphor of balance and mixed government come together in both the works of Necker and Adams. I'm grateful for this, for reminding me of Adams. Bill?
Yes, let me just start with a declaration. Okay, so I think this is our problem today. On the one hand, we need a robust conception of popular sovereignty. Right? Your other hero, Tocqueville, he's right about this. Democracy is here. We have to understand it properly, and we don't want to give up on that. And then we need to figure out, right, how the executive power, which has to have some autonomy, which cannot be understood, should not be understood in mechanical, legalistic terms, how that nonetheless can remain somehow democratically accountable. I think that's the problem. There are a lot of other problems we can talk about. That's a major problem. And there's lots of debates about that. The other major problem we have today is the executive is not just the executive. It's not just whatever, the king or the president. It's the administrative state, this massive bureaucracy, which we have for better or for worse. That's the modern executive. And I guess I'm skeptical if you think Necker, maybe you're not saying this, but I just don't see how Necker helps us with those problems. It seems to me in the paper, in your comments, your remarks, you're working with a very traditional conception of the executive. It's not surprising the Liberty Fund is publishing this. The administrative state is not there, That's a problem.
But they criticize the administrative state.
Right, exactly, right. And so I don't, but even more importantly, even more, I think, in terms of the argument you're making, I just don't see how Necker can be described as a sufficiently robust Democrat. There are places where he seems very, very anti-democratic. It sounds to me as though you might be conflating these two different levels of analysis we might want to separate, right? So there are institutional questions about the legislature and the executive, and then there's normative questions about legitimacy. And I just don't see him as being at the place where we all have to be in terms of normative legitimacy, which is that liberal democracy is what it's about, and a sufficiently democratic form of liberal democracy. I just don't see that in Necker. And you know, just as I'm reading Rosa and Valland's book on executive power, and what I just said, basically, a lot of it comes from him. I mean, he's actually has some very nice things to say about Necker, but he thinks Necker really is not a modern Democrat, and that's why you're just not going to get very far with him. Also, I'll just say methodologically, I'm trying to provoke you again, my dear friend. I mean, this moderate versus immoderate stuff, I just think this is so ideological. It just gets in the way of dealing with these serious theoretical questions, because we have good guys and bad guys from the beginning of the discussion. And I see why you want to call him a moderate. I mean, conservative liberal is the way to go. I think that's a better term. But I just think this loads this in a way that really doesn't allow us to deal in the way we need to with these really tough questions.
These are excellent points, Federica.
I just wanted to sort of follow up on one of the comments, particularly the distinction between institutional and normative, which I think is really problematic just to make to begin with. And I'm wondering, like, I'm reading your paper and I don't know anything beyond what you've told me in the paper and here in the presentation about this author. But I wonder what the contribution on both you think Necker is making, from both a normative and institutional perspective. Because I don't see, and perhaps this follows up on spring break was my time. Sorry.
I thought that was a problem reserved for people my age.
I know, it says a lot. Anyways, just follow up on Ken's point. Like, how is this sort of like giving us a new institutional way to think about the balance of power? But how is this also giving us a new normative way of thinking about the balance of power that is not like a Polybian Aristotelian? That's not even going to defining factors. But I just don't see what the sort of like a uniqueness. This is a fascinating piece and a fascinating author, but I just don't see the uniqueness in terms of either institutional or normative. And I think that the two cannot be separated. So I wonder if you can like say something.
Okay, well,
Perfectly separated, but you can delineate. Sorry, that's
no,
This was not meant to Chris.
No, but I'm qualified.
Absolutely.
These are excellent points, and I'm grateful for raising them. So let me start with this. So yeah, Necker is not a Democrat in our sense of the word. I agree with you, Bill. It's I would put in a constitutional liberal, but liberal, which is something that is probably not the way in which we define liberalism here. For him, the most important thing was the motto of the paper. I think is that there is no real liberty, or at least there is no secure freedom, if there is an authority without balance in the state. And I think that gives you a sense of what is after. He wants a constitutional framework in which the powers are kind of on not an equal plane, but there is no overpowering presence on one side of the political spectrum or other. So I agree that in many respects what we have today is a notion of executive power that he could not have anticipated. And we do have the administrative state, we have the bureaucracy, we have this kind of thing. But I do think, going back to Ken's first question, that we still emphasize separation of powers, and we don't talk much about balance and blending of powers. And this is where I think, coming back to Federica's question, I think that the institutional aspects here are quite interesting. What does it mean to have a separation of powers and balance of powers and blending of powers?
But that's Polybius' exact point, right? Like Polybius' like sort of like an idea. It's like the powers are both intersecting with one another and controlling one another. And I mean, I was pushing you on this because the echoes just like come back to me so clear in a way.
Well,
so I'm wondering.
There is also Cicero, right, with the harmony of powers, like the choir in Res Publica. But this is something new, I think, in Necker's case, because he looks at the French Constitution, and certainly the image of the mixed government has roots in Polybius, has roots in Cicero, has roots in Aristotle. So nothing new under the sun. But in this case, the blending, the checks and balances, institutionalized in the form of the way in which he redefines the executive and the legislative, I think these are things that at least make him original in this respect. Like with all authors in history of political thought, it's very difficult to highlight what's really new and what we should learn from them. So I fully grant both points. But Bill would have liked him to be a little bit more Democrat, I guess.
No, just a question of how does this speak to us? And I guess I would like to hear more about the blending, because I'm not convinced that's new either. The American system has blending.
Yeah, well,
Right.
he looks at the American
So,
case.
all right, so what's distinct?
He looks at the American
Yeah,
case.
right.
He looks at the English case. He said he wants to have a kind of a combination between the American and the English in the French context.
But the American case is complicated because
It is complicated.
the federal constitution has this kind of blending, but the state constitutions of that time did not. They had a real strict separation of functions.
Yeah.
So if he was borrowing from both, how does he square that circle?
I don't know how this squares that circle, but he certainly did look at and read carefully the state constitutions of Massachusetts and Virginia.
But those have, the legislature makes the laws.
But the mixed government model appears
It's not a mixed government model.
in the Massachusetts state constitution.
Eventually.
Eventually.
But the general pattern was the legislature makes the law and the executive carries them out. And
No,
so
I haven't
it's the same.
reread the Massachusetts one. You know them better, but I will have to look at that.
But the other-
Adams came to think of both of them as a mistake.
Yeah,
That's
that's
their
right.
separation.
That's right.
And so one of the interesting things at that very time, when he was saying we want to take something from the American model wasn't fixed yet because this debate was going on about how much power the executive should have, especially at the federal level. Right? This was the big fallout between Adams and Jefferson.
And Madison and Hamilton.
Yeah.
Which was what I think Necker understood from the American model. So he's writing this in 1792. The Americans were still debating that. He thought that the Americans were less rigid in tackling the issue of executive power, and he thought that the French were very rigid because they looked at the executive power as a danger to liberty.
But the context is so different. It was the vacuum of power that led to the U.S. Constitution, not the collapse of an
The
absolute
collapse of
monarchy.
absolute power,
And so
absolutely, yeah.
Why you would go to one case for examples of what would work in a very different context.
Bear in mind that he looked at the English case as
That makes it more relevant.
But
Yeah,
the English
as-
case, England was just about to change as
Yes.
well, moving towards parliamentary sovereignty.
Right.
Yeah.
right, which you would probably Federica's question earlier probably meant come back to the issue of constitution. The Charter of 1814 actually implements, which is the charter after the fall of Napoleon, implements most of the constitutional principles advocated by Necker in this book. So in a way, it's a posthumous triumph in 1814. It's a charter that is changed in 1830, and then that's the last time France had a king after the change of dynasty. So in a way, the principles were enshrined in the Charter of 1814, which I haven't reread for this, but.
I would also like to follow up this question about the institutional implications of Necker's theory. I found that his idea of intertwine of powers very interesting, intertwine between the legislative and the executive powers. Maybe we can direct our discussion to his writing by asking whether Necker had a preference for parliamentarism to presidentialism at his time, because at that time, I think presidentialism was very new at that time, and it set a model of separating the executive power in a democratic sense compared to the previous parliamentarism like in Britain. And this can be also related to our contemporary discussion, because recently there are some political scientists arguing that parliamentarism is by nature better than presidentialism, because the former, naturally, promotes the coordination between the legislative branch and the executive branch. So I want to ask whether Necker provided any like evaluations of the institutions at his time, like which model is better.
Well, these are our terms today, so I don't think he would think in those terms. So when he was in power, France had a system that was not functional. So the States General had not met for 160 years, since 1614, basically. And in the States General, the third estate was inferior to the first two, the nobles and the clergy. So he wanted to reform that. So he thought that the country needs a new representational system, and he fought for that. When the States General opened on May 5th, 1789, he gave a very long speech, 3 hours long speech, which was terrible. He was a bad orator, and 3 hour speech in which he advocated the doubling of the representation of the estates, so that the third estate actually has proper representation. So he saw that the country had a structural problem to begin with. He looked at England as a model, as I said, for blending the nobles with a king that reigns but doesn't govern. So that was the model that he thought France could have adopted at the time. And then, as he learns more about the American case, I think he becomes appreciative of the ways in which the Americans were not dogmatic about the executive power. So that's how I interpret his navigating between the poles of England and France with regard to the intertwining of powers. Now, the French, strangely, it was in France that the notion of, for example, of a Supreme Court came first in the works of Sieyès in 1795. Sieyès never managed to convince the French that they needed a kind of a power checking the constitutionality of the laws, so that was abandoned. But it was 1795. This was before the Americans did it in 1803, and I think that would have been another example of the institutionalization of this principle in practice. Now, one other thing I would say, in the French Revolution, and Necker is part of this, though less successfully than others, there was an attempt to create a balance of powers by elevating a power above all other powers, and that is the concept of neutral power. And the concept of neutral power doesn't appear in Necker's works, properly speaking. I see here and there bits and pieces of the concept. You need a power that is above all powers, that regulates the political game in such a way that no power can hijack the political scene. But that concept appears in full spate only later in the works of Benjamin Constant in 1802, excuse me, and in the Principles of Politics in 1805. So this is the concept of neutral power that appears in God. So that's missing in Necker in order to create a full balance of powers intertwining and neutral power.
Does Necker make take any discussion on how long the Constitution ought to exist? I know, I think it was Madison wrote it should last for a generation and then be revisited. Does Necker come out of there? I'm sorry?
Jefferson.
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 I knew if I told myself don't say it because you're getting it wrong, and I said it. Right. Okay, but does he make...
Probably in line with the response I gave to Bill's question, I think that he would have been quite skeptical that should be the case.
Wait, so what do you mean? No amendment procedures?
No, there are amendment procedures, but certainly you wouldn't want a constitution written by every generation.
Yeah.
Wouldn't.
He would not, probably.
Because in the French case, they've had several constitutions, right? Since
They had too many constitutions.
right.
They wrote one every generation.
Yeah.
Well, Sieyès had the constitution in every pocket of his jacket.
Last 2 weeks.
In a couple of years,
I think like the Civil War.
In your fourth act, you talk about kind of the comparative analysis and
Very briefly,
yeah, the sequence of events and why maybe the American example would be incompatible with the French case. does Necker talk at all? So I'm a little bit familiar with Haiti, and Haiti was beginning their revolution in 1791. It was a pretty big deal to France. Does he speak at all about whether some sort of, in a different case, a non-Anglo case, would he think that the separation of powers would be appropriate in a place like Haiti if a revolution were to exist and be successful? Or does he think it only a type of system reserved for a special segment of the world?
Well, I think constitutions are organic documents, he would say, that have to reflect the spirit of the place. But I don't know what he would have thought in this case. For the French, he thought that a good constitution that is true to the needs of the French people would have to take into account the traditions on the place. So that's all I can answer.
Yeah, just
But Necker is an interesting figure in this regard because he's not only a Montesquieu. He's not only someone who takes Montesquieu's ideas and rehashes them. He was a politician as well as a thinker. So I think that the emphasis on the need to act prudently in reforming institutions is reflected by his political career. He was quite revolutionary for publishing the finances of the kingdom in 1781. So in that regard, for us it's pretty simple. It's in keeping with the principle of publicity, but publicity then was seen as a weapon against the old regime, against the practices of the old regime. So in a way, he was in the forefront. So in this case, he was not conservative. He was actually quite revolutionary within the confines of the old regime. Federica.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about the way in which the nature of executive power is discussed in the paper, and perhaps this goes
In the
back
first
to
part, right?
To the what?
In the first part?
Yeah, the traditional nature of executive power. Because I was confused by what I thought in my immense ignorance. I was confused by it, by a slip. What I thought was a slippage between sort of like a ordinary versus emergency situations, where like I do not conceive of executive power as something absolute, as something that whose the nature of which is like inherently sort of like essentially different from the sort of like the power from the other parts, right? And it seems to me that we identify the executive as something intrinsically different from the legislative and the judiciary in the context of emergency powers. And we can conceive of emergency powers in the sort of like a Roman tradition up all the way to the Schmittian tradition, and sort of like see how like the slippage becomes like more consistent in some ways. So I was wondering if like this is a slippage that is germane to the writing of Necker. This is a slippage that is sort of like a part of the way in which you interpret his writings, or part of the illustration of the conception of executive power by someone who lived in an emergency, right? Like there was historical conditions, like perhaps like made it a little bit more difficult to identify what's emergency and what's ordinary. Or I might be completely wrong, and I'm just like misinterpreting.
No. I think it's you're onto something here. So, as I said at the beginning, it's very odd that he writes this book on executive power in 1792.
Right.
It is a kind of emergency situation because the French were gravitating towards a regime that was inimical to liberty. The terror would start a year later. And he saw it coming. He saw it coming in the functions that were given to the king. When he writes the book in 1792, the king was still there, but it was a king that was destitute of its functions and of its role anymore. It was like a puppet. It was a republic with a king at its head, he says, and that's something unacceptable. So it was a form of, it was a critique of a form of emergency situation, and he saw the terror coming. He wasn't the only one, of course, so this is not the point. But he thought that the country had one power that was way over up there, and then the executive power being completely destitute of any means to exercise its proper functions. And that was the concern. So in a way, it's he writes this as a kind of warning. He writes as a kind of a vindication of his own political philosophy. One thing that is difficult with Necker is to assess where he draws the line between theory and his justification of his own positions, and that's a little bit frustrating with both him and Madame de Staël, his daughter, who wrote many books to justify his father's initiatives. But at the end of the day, I think that the notion of executive power that he works with here has to be read within the confines of constitutional monarchy. Yeah,
I think
we
that
have one more
this-
time. Yeah, one more.
In a way, this follows on Federica's question. When we look through the lens of separation of powers, we see something that we identify as the executive. Picking up from a question that Russ raised earlier, I was thinking about state and local governments in the United States. Not so much in terms of the specific question that Russ raised, but it got me thinking about the commonality at the state and local level in the United States of plural executives. Especially sort of post-Jacksonian reforms of people electing their governor and electing their attorney general and electing their treasurer and electing their auditor, and even, thinking about Tocqueville writing in the 1830s and the 19 principal offices of a New England township, which exists for some reason other than just something for us to torture undergraduate students with, I think. But to make the point that so many of these functions of government that at the national government level we kind of lump all together and call that executive, that the state and local government levels throughout U.S. history post-Constitution have often been subdivided. And even later, at the turn of the 20th century, the idea that you would have a mayor and a city manager, or the idea that you would have a commission form of government that sort of fuses the legislative and executive bodies together so that each of the legislators is also the head of a department. And I just want to ask, I know it's unfair in some sense because Necker's writing before all of this, and I haven't read Necker and you have, so I guess what I'm asking is, given your close reading of Necker, what would Necker think about
It's a very good question.
the dividing of the executive? Because it sounds like he writes about the executive as if it's singular.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to answer the question.
No
It's a
problem.
great question because in a way it builds upon Bill's previous question, like how the concept of executive has changed and has evolved.
Sure.
Bill took it in a more contemporary. This is a 19th century question. I think that he would. He certainly was not a fan of the Directory, which was a plural executive that governed France after 1795. And he saw the failure of the Directory, 5 leaders, as responsible for the catastrophe called Napoleon Bonaparte. So in a way, I think that anything about the plural executive would raise major questions.
It sounded like it from your reflection of
Yes,
him.
but Necker,
But it was common at the state and local level.
Yeah, but
in
Necker,
the U.S. from early days.
Yeah, Necker did like the principles principle of federalism. So in a way, he might say, well, it works in some context, but it wouldn't work in. He was concerned with the legacy of strong centralization in France. So one could say that while he was for a unitary executive, he wanted to disseminate throughout the French society some seeds of decentralization that were badly needed to bring reforms in the Kingdom of France. So that was a problem that he saw I think Rosa Malone does make some references to, I mean, certainly when he writes about the political model in France, this is a centralized model. There were attempts at decentralizing it. Necker may not be the first name that comes to mind, I think, because he's seen as a centralizer in some respects, but there are some elements that can be construed as decentralizing in his thought.
Let me just pick up the moderating ball here. No, it was not a joke that we allow the moderation man to moderate his own.
Hey.
This has a massive breakdown in communications for which I am
No problem.
very sorry. I apologize for that. But I would ask you to please join me in thanking Aurelian for his time.
Thank you. I do have a request. If you have comments on the written...
Your call will be disconnected.